She threw champagne in his face at the most exclusive gala. And for the first time in 20 years, Henry Porter didn't know what to say. The most powerful man in Manhattan finance just had Dom Perignon dripping from his Armani suit, courtesy of a Harlem schoolteacher who didn't know or care who he was. In a room full of people who would kill for his attention, the only woman who held it was walking away. She wasn't just some party crasher. She was there representing the very community his latest development project was about to destroy. Have you ever stood up to someone everyone else was terrified of? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. What happens when a most feared man in finance meets the only woman in New York who isn't afraid of him? Have you ever been so angry about injustice that you forgot to be scared? Tonight, Principal met power and champagne flew. But what started as the worst night of his career might just become the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to him. If you've ever wondered what real courage looks like when it faces absolute power, this story will change how you see everything. Stay with me as we dive into a night that shattered two worlds and rebuilt them into something neither saw coming. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Henry Porter stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, surveying a sea of Manhattan's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across marble floors. Designer gowns swirled between perfectly tailored tuxedos. 500 of New York's wealthiest citizens hung on his every word about urban renewal and revitalization projects. At 42, Henry commanded respect through fear. His steel gray eyes had closed million-dollar deals and destroyed careers with equal ease. Tonight was supposed to be his victory lap, announcing the Crown Heights development that would net his firm $200 million in profits. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried effortlessly across the room. Sometimes progress requires difficult choices. The Crown Heights project represents our commitment to transforming underutilized urban spaces into thriving communities. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Henry's lips curved into what passed for his smile. Calculated, cold, effective. When we break ground next month, we'll be creating jobs, increasing property values, and bringing modern amenities to an area that has been overlooked. That's when she stood up. Jasmine Williams rose from a table near the back, her simple black dress stark against the sea of sequins and silk around her. 32 years old, with natural hair pulled into an elegant updo and skin that seemed to glow under the ballroom lights. She looked completely out of place and entirely comfortable with that fact. "Excuse me." Her voice cut through the murmur of conversation, clear and strong enough to reach the front of the room. "I'd like to ask a question." Henry's eyes found her immediately. Something about the way she stood, shoulders back, chin raised, completely unafraid, made the room feel smaller. Security guards shifted forward, but Henry raised his hand slightly, curiosity overriding protocol. "You're not on the guest list," he said, not unkindly, but with the authority of someone used to controlling every variable. "No, I'm not." Jasmine stepped into the aisle, and Henry noticed how every head turned to follow her movement. "I'm Jasmine Williams. I teach third grade at PS 163 in Crown Heights. You know, that underutilized urban space you're planning to transform." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter ran through the crowd. Henry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In 20 years of business, no one had ever challenged him publicly. The fact that it was happening now, in front of New York's power brokers, should have enraged him. Instead, he found himself studying her face, noting the fire in her dark eyes, the way she commanded attention without raising her voice. "Ms. Williams," he said carefully, "I'm sure you understand that progress sometimes requires progress." Jasmine's laugh had no humor in it. "Is that what you call forcing Mrs. Rodriguez to close the bodega she's run for 30 years? Progress is evicting the Martinez family from the apartment where they raised 6 kids? Progress is tearing down the only playground my students have ever known so you can build another parking garage." The ballroom fell dead silent. Henry could feel 500 pairs of eyes watching this exchange. waiting to see how Manhattan's most ruthless businessman would handle being dressed down by a schoolteacher. He should have had her removed, should have dismissed her concerns with practiced corporate speak, should have regained control of his own event. Instead, he stepped away from the podium and walked down into the crowd, stopping just close enough to see the gold flecks in her angry eyes. "You think you know what's best for communities you've never set foot in," Jasmine continued, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "You see numbers on a spreadsheet where we see homes. You see profit margins where we see families." Henry found himself close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume, something warm and understated that had nothing to do with expensive department stores. Close enough to see that her hands weren't shaking despite the magnitude of what she was doing. "Your revitalization means children lose their schools, grandmothers get pushed out of neighborhoods they've called home for decades, and small businesses that have been community anchors for generations disappear overnight." The silence stretched between them, electric and dangerous. Henry realized that everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see what happened when an immovable object met an unstoppable force. "And you," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to something just above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "You sleep well at night knowing that your profits come from other people's pain." That's when she picked up the champagne glass from the nearest table and threw its contents directly into his face. The Dom Perignon hit him like ice water, soaking through his $1,000 shirt, dripping from his perfectly styled hair onto his Italian leather shoes. The room erupted in shocked gasps and nervous laughter. Henry stood there, champagne dripping from his chin, staring at this woman who had just done what no board member, competitor, or business rival had ever dared to do. She had made him look human. What was the last time you saw someone stand up for what's right? Consequences be damned. Drop a fire emoji if you've ever been that person. Security moved toward Jasmine, but Henry raised his hand, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. Let her speak. What happened next would change both their lives forever. He offered her a chair at the most exclusive table in New York. She offered him a lesson in what his money was really destroying. The Plaza Ballroom felt like it was holding its breath. 500 of Manhattan's most powerful people sat frozen, champagne glasses halfway to their lips, watching a Harlem schoolteacher face down a man who could buy and sell most of them before breakfast. Henry Porter stood there with Dom Perignon still dripping from his hair, and for the first time in 20 years, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. The smart move, the Henry Porter move, would be to have security escort her out, make a joke about passionate community advocates, and return to his prepared remarks. Instead, he heard himself say, "Would you like to continue from up here?" Jasmine blinked, clearly not expecting that response. Around them, the whispered conversation stopped entirely. Even the waitstaff froze, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. "What?" she asked, thrown off balance for the first time since she'd stood up. "You have something to say about Crown Heights," Henry said, pulling out his handkerchief to wipe champagne from his face with movements that were almost casual. "It seems like these people should hear it." He gestured toward the microphone he'd abandoned, then toward the crowd of politicians, real estate moguls, and socialites who were staring at them like they were watching a car accident in slow motion. Jasmine's eyes narrowed. "You're trying to embarrass me." "No," Henry said, and something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. "I'm trying to understand why a third-grade teacher would risk her career to throw champagne at a man she's never met." The challenge hung between them like electricity. Jasmine could feel every eye in the room on her, could practically hear the smartphones recording this moment for social media immortality. She had two choices: back down and slink out of the ballroom, or take the platform he was offering and say what she really came here to say. She walked toward the podium. The crowd parted as she moved through them, her simple black dress commanding more attention than all the designer gowns combined. When she reached the front of the room, Henry was still standing there, champagne stains on his perfect shirt, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Ms. Williams," he said quietly, "just for her, they're all yours." Jasmine stepped behind the microphone and looked out at a sea of faces that represented more money and power than she'd see in 10 lifetimes of teaching. For just a moment, her resolve wavered. These people lived in a world so different from hers that they might as well be from different planets. But then she thought about her students, about Mrs. Rodriguez crying as she packed up her store, about the Martinez children asking why they had to move away from their friends. "My name is Jasmine Williams," she began, her voice clear and strong. "6 months ago, I received a letter telling me that the school where I teach, where I've worked for 8 years, would be demolished to make way for luxury condominiums." She paused, letting that sink in. She could see some faces in the crowd shifting uncomfortably. That letter didn't come from the school board. It didn't come from the Department of Education. It came from Porter Development Group, informing us that our lease would not be renewed due to planned improvements to the property. Henry's face remained impassive, but Jasmine caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "PS 163 serves 400 children," she continued. "Children who walk to school through neighborhoods their families have called home for generations. Children who depend on that building not just for education, but for breakfast when their parents work double shifts, for after-school programs when there's nowhere else safe to go." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the clink of ice settling in water glasses. But Mr. Porter's company didn't just target our school. The Crown Heights project plans to demolish 12 city blocks. 12 blocks that house 2,000 families, 37 small businesses, 1 community center, 2 churches, and a senior center that provides meals for elderly residents who have nowhere else to go. Jasmine's voice grew stronger as she found her rhythm, feeding off the energy of finally being able to tell this story to people with the power to do something about it. You want to know what underutilized urban space really means? It means communities that don't have lawyers who golf with city planners. It means families who work 2 jobs and can't afford to attend $1,000-a-plate galas to defend their right to exist. She gestured toward the crowd, encompassing the glittering jewelry and perfect hair and clothes that cost more than most people made in a month. "Every person in this room tonight could buy and sell my entire neighborhood without checking their bank balance. But you know what you can't buy? You can't buy the way Mrs. Rodriguez knows every kid in the neighborhood by name and slips them free candy when their parents aren't looking. You can't buy 30 years of Mr. Chun teaching Tai Chi in the park every morning to seniors who depend on that routine to stay healthy." Henry found himself leaning forward slightly, caught up in her passion despite himself. There was something mesmerizing about watching someone speak with complete conviction, without calculation or agenda, beyond the simple desire to protect what they loved. You can't buy the sound of children playing in streets where their grandparents played, or the way neighbors share everything from recipes to babysitting duties, because they know community isn't something you build with blueprints and construction crews. Community is something you grow over decades of people choosing to care about each other. Jasmine's eyes found Henry's across the room, and for a moment it felt like they were the only 2 people there. "Mr. Porter calls it progress. I call it destruction. He sees property values and profit margins. I see my student Marcus, who's already moved 3 times in his 8 years of life because developers keep improving his neighborhoods right out from under him." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet after the champagne incident. This silence felt heavy with consideration, with the weight of truths that were uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. Have you ever had someone really listen when everyone else just heard noise? Tell me about a time someone surprised you by paying attention. Henry stepped forward, and the crowd seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see how he would respond to being challenged so completely in front of his peers. "Ms. Williams," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room, "would you be willing to show me what I'm missing?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jasmine stared at him, trying to read the expression on his face, searching for the trap she was sure had to be there. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. "I mean," Henry said, "I'd like to see Crown Heights through your eyes. Not from architectural plans or market research, but from the ground up. Would you be willing to give me that tour?" The crowd erupted in murmurs. This was not how these events typically went. Manhattan power brokers did not make public concessions to community activists. They certainly didn't request personal tours of neighborhoods they were planning to demolish. Jasmine felt the weight of 500 stairs, the pressure of representing not just herself, but her entire community. She thought about all the reasons she should say no, all the ways this could go wrong. Instead, she heard herself say, "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Don't be late." After the crowd dispersed and the last camera flashed, Henry approached her with something she didn't expect. Not an apology, but a business card. "I want to see it," he said quietly. "Your neighborhood. Tomorrow." She should have said no. Instead, she heard herself say, 10 a.m. Don't be late. The man who owned half of Manhattan had never really seen New York until a Harlem schoolteacher showed him what home actually looked like. Henry Porter had been awake since 4 a.m., which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was spending those pre-dawn hours researching Crown Heights demographics instead of reviewing quarterly reports. What was even more unusual was the knot in his stomach as his driver navigated through streets he'd only seen as property assessments and zoning maps. At exactly 10 a.m., his black Mercedes pulled up outside PS 163. The school building looked nothing like the sterile architectural photos in his development files. Bright murals covered the brick walls. Children's artwork depicting families and neighborhoods and dreams painted in colors so vivid they seemed to pulse with life. Kids' laughter echoed from somewhere behind the building, mixing with the sounds of traffic and street vendors and music spilling from open windows. Henry stepped out of the car and immediately felt overdressed. His Italian leather shoes seemed too shiny against the cracked sidewalk. His suit, perfectly tailored for boardrooms and country clubs, marked him as an outsider more clearly than if he'd worn a sign. Jasmine emerged from the school's front entrance right on time, wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater that made her look younger and somehow more formidable at the same time. She'd pulled her hair back in a ponytail, and Henry found himself noticing the graceful line of her neck, the way she moved with easy confidence through a world that was completely hers. "You came," she said, and he heard surprise in her voice despite her matter-of-fact tone. "I said I would," Henry replied, then felt stupid for stating the obvious. "Most people say a lot of things they don't mean," Jasmine said, studying his face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Especially people in expensive suits." Henry looked down at his outfit, the same type of armor he wore every day to signal success and power. Here just made him look like what he was, someone who didn't belong. "Should I have dressed differently?" he asked. "That depends," Jasmine said, starting to walk down the street. "Are you here to see my neighborhood, or to evaluate your investment opportunity?" The question hit harder than it should have. Henry fell in a step beside her, noting how different the streets looked at ground level. From his office 40 floors above Manhattan, everything looked clean and organized, reducible to numbers and development potential. Down here, he could smell the rich aroma of Caribbean spices from a nearby restaurant, hear conversations in 3 different languages, see the way people nodded to each other in recognition and familiarity. "This is Mrs. Rodriguez's store," Jasmine said, stopping in front of a small bodega with hand-painted signs advertising everything from phone cards to fresh plantains. "She's been here since before I was born." Through the window, Henry could see an elderly woman arranging fruit, her movements careful and practiced. A young mother with 2 small children was picking out items while the kids pressed their faces against the glass freezer case, debating ice cream flavors. "She employs 6 people from the neighborhood," Jasmine continued. "Teenagers who need after-school jobs, parents who need flexible hours. When your development goes through, they'll all have to find work somewhere else, if they can." Henry watched the interaction inside the store, the way Mrs. Rodriguez smiled at the children, how she seemed to know exactly what the young mother needed before she asked for it. It was the kind of organic community connection that urban planners tried to recreate in mixed-use developments but never quite captured. "What makes you think I haven't considered economic impact?" Henry asked, though the question sounded weak even to him. Jasmine gave him a look that was equal parts amusement and frustration. "Because if you had, you would have realized that displacing 37 small businesses doesn't create jobs. It destroys them. Your luxury condos will bring in a Whole Foods and a Starbucks, maybe a boutique fitness studio. 3 businesses where there used to be 37. 20 jobs where there used to be 200. They walked past a community garden where elderly men played dominoes in the afternoon sun, while children chased each other between carefully tended vegetable plots. Past a church with services advertised in Spanish and English and Creole. Past a barbershop where the conversation was as much the attraction as the haircuts.
"You see decay," Jasmine said, gesturing toward a building with peeling paint and patched brick. "I see Mr. Johnson, who's lived there for 40 years and watches the street to make sure kids get home from school safely. You see inefficient land use. I see community." Henry found himself really looking at the buildings for the first time, noticing details his site surveys had missed. Window boxes full of flowers, hand-painted apartment numbers, fire escapes that doubled as social spaces where neighbors talked across the gaps between buildings. "The community center," Jasmine said, stopping in front of a converted warehouse with colorful banners hanging outside, "offers everything from GED classes to senior meals to childcare for working parents. When you tear it down, where do you think those services go?" "There are other community centers," Henry said, but the words felt hollow. 40 minutes away by subway," Jasmine replied. "If you can afford the fare. If you can take time off work. If you can arrange childcare for the children you're trying to bring to the other childcare." The practical obstacles he'd never considered hit him like physical blows. In his world, distance was measured in minutes between air-conditioned cars and private elevators. He'd never thought about what 40 minutes meant to someone working 2 jobs or caring for elderly parents or managing on a fixed income. They rounded a corner and nearly collided with a group of children who recognized Jasmine and immediately surrounded her with hugs and rapid-fire Spanish and English updates about lost teeth and family pets and weekend adventures. "Ms. Williams, Ms. Williams." A small boy with gap-toothed grin tugged on her sweater. "My abuela made empanadas, and she said to give you some." Henry watched Jasmine's face transform as she knelt down to the boy's level, asking about his grandmother in careful Spanish, listening to his excited response with the kind of attention most adults reserve for their bosses or clients. "This is Marcus," she said, introducing Henry to a serious-faced 8-year-old who studied him with frank curiosity. "Marcus, this is Mr. Porter. Are you Ms. Williams' boyfriend?" Marcus asked with the devastating directness of childhood. Henry felt heat creep up his neck. We're discussing business." "Oh," Marcus said, clearly losing interest. "My mom says businessmen are why we have to move again." The casual statement hit Henry harder than Jasmine's passionate speech the night before. This wasn't political rhetoric or community activism. This was a child who'd learned to expect displacement as a normal part of life. When was the last time someone showed you their world, really showed you, not just the pretty parts? Share a memory of seeing life through someone else's eyes. As the children scattered back to their games, Jasmine stood up and fixed Henry with a steady gaze. "Still think this is just underutilized urban space?" Henry looked around at the street corner where they stood, at the elderly woman sweeping her front steps, the teenagers helping her carry groceries, the way people moved through the space with the ease of belonging. For the first time in his career, he was seeing the human cost of development, not as an abstract concept, but as faces and names and stories. "What if there was another way?" he heard himself say. Jasmine went very still. "What do you mean?" Before he could answer, her phone rang with the sharp urgency of an emergency call. As she answered, Henry could hear the panic in the voice on the other end. Something about the school, something that couldn't wait. "I have to go," she said, already moving toward the building behind them. "There's a problem with one of my students." Henry should have returned his car, gone back to his office, filed this morning under due diligence, and moved forward with his original plans. Instead, he found himself following her through the doors of PS 163, into a world he was beginning to realize he'd never understood at all. As they stood outside the community center that would be demolished for his project, Henry said something that stopped her cold. What if there was another way? Before she could ask what he meant, her phone rang. An emergency at school that couldn't wait. But his words followed her another way. She drew a line in the sand between their worlds. he crossed it anyway, not as a conqueror, but as a man who'd finally found something worth fighting for. The emergency at PS 163 turned out to be 8-year-old Marcus, the same boy who'd asked if Henry was Jasmine's boyfriend. Locked in a bathroom stall, refusing to come out because his mother had told him they were moving again and he didn't want to leave his school. Henry stood in the hallway outside the third-grade classrooms, feeling completely out of place among the colorful bulletin boards and child-sized furniture. Through the thin walls, he could hear Jasmine's voice, patient and warm, talking Marcus through his tears. "I know you're scared," she was saying. "Moving is scary, but you know what? You're brave. Remember when you were afraid of reading out loud, and then you did it anyway?" Henry found himself drawn closer to the bathroom door, struck by the gentleness in her voice. In boardrooms, he was used to hearing people speak with authority, with calculation, with the kind of professional distance that kept emotions safely contained. This was something different, genuine care without agenda. "But I don't want to go to a new school." Marcus's voice was small, muffled by the bathroom stall. "I like it here. I like you. And I like you too," Jasmine said. "So much. That's never going to change, even if you move to a different school. Promise?" "I promise." 20 minutes later, Marcus emerged from the bathroom, his hand firmly gripping Jasmine's as they walked back toward his classroom. He stopped when he saw Henry waiting in the hallway. "You're still here," Marcus said, not accusingly but with the frank observation of childhood. "Yes," Henry said, not sure why that was true. "Are you going to help Ms. Williams save our school?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Henry looked down at this 8-year-old boy who was facing his third forced relocation in his short life, then at Jasmine, who was watching Henry's face carefully. "I don't know," Henry said honestly. "I'm trying to figure that out." Marcus nodded solemnly, as if this was a perfectly reasonable answer, and disappeared into his classroom. Henry and Jasmine were left alone in the hallway, surrounded by children's artwork and the distant sounds of learning. "You didn't have to stay," Jasmine said quietly. "Yes, I did," Henry replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Some things matter more than business." Jasmine studied his face, searching for something. "Don't," she said finally. "Don't what?" "Don't make me hope this matters to you. Don't make me think you might actually care about these kids, about this community, if you're just going to go back to your office tomorrow and proceed with demolition plans." Her words hit him like cold water. Henry realized that somewhere in the last few hours, something fundamental had shifted in his thinking. The development project that had seemed like a straightforward business decision yesterday now felt impossibly complicated. "What if I told you I was reconsidering the project?" "I'd say you were lying," Jasmine replied without hesitation. Rich men don't change their minds because they spend one morning in Harlem. They don't walk away from $200 million profits because a school teacher shows them around her neighborhood. "What if this rich man did?" Jasmine's laugh held no humor. "Then I'd say you were trying to impress me, and I'd wonder what you wanted in return." The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. Henry was trying to impress her, though he wasn't sure when that had started or why it mattered so much. But her assumption about his motives, that everything was transactional, that kindness always came with a price, made him realize how his world looked from the outside. "What would it take?" he asked. "What would what take? For you to believe that someone might actually want to do the right thing without expecting anything in return?" Jasmine was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. Around them, the school hummed with afternoon activity. Children's voices, teachers moving between classrooms, the everyday sounds of education happening. "Proof," she said finally. "Not words, not promises. Action." "What kind of action?" "Cancel the project," Jasmine said, meeting his eyes directly. "Kill the Crown Heights development. Today. Not because it's not profitable, but because it's wrong." Henry felt something tight in his chest. She was asking him to walk away from the biggest project of his career, to disappoint investors who trusted him with their money, to admit that 20 years of business philosophy might have been misguided. "That's not a small request," he said. "No," Jasmine agreed. "It's not." They stood there in the elementary school hallway, two people from completely different worlds, negotiating the price of principle. Henry could feel the weight of the choice settling on his shoulders. Continue with business as usual, or step into unknown territory, guided only by the conviction that this woman and this community mattered more than his profit margins. "If I did that," he said carefully, "would you have dinner with me?" Jasmine's eyes flashed. "I knew it. I knew there had to be something." "No," Henry interrupted, stepping closer. "Not as payment, not as a reward, but because I'd like to get to know the woman who's making me question everything I thought I knew about success." The intensity in his voice made her take a step back. "You don't know me. That's the problem," Henry said. "I want to." The admission hung between them, more honest than either had expected. Jasmine could feel her carefully maintained boundaries starting to waver. This man represented everything she'd spent her career fighting against, but something in his eyes made her believe he might actually be willing to choose differently. "One dinner," she heard herself say, "if you cancel the project. Not because I'm asking you to, but because you understand why you should." Have you ever had someone show up when you least expected it but needed it most? When someone surprised you by caring? Share your story. That evening, Henry sat in his office long after his staff had gone home, staring at the Crown Heights development files spread across his desk. His phone buzzed with messages from investors, from board members, from the construction team waiting for final approval to begin demolition. He thought about Marcus, afraid to leave his bathroom stall, about Mrs. Rodriguez arranging fruit in her store window, about Jasmine's voice, patient and warm, promising a scared child that being cared about didn't depend on geography. At midnight, he picked up his phone and called Jasmine. "I'm canceling the project," he said when she answered. There was silence on the other end. Then why? "Because you were right. Some things matter more than money." "Henry, have dinner with me," he said, and his voice was different, vulnerable in a way she'd never heard from him. "Not business, not charity, just us." Jasmine closed her eyes, knowing that saying yes would change everything. She said it anyway. As they locked up the school together, Henry caught her hand. "Have dinner with me," he said, and something in his voice made it less request than plea. "Not business, not charity, just us." She knew saying yes would change everything. She said it anyway. She agreed to one dinner to prove they had nothing in common. Instead, she discovered they were both hungry for something they'd never allowed themselves to want. Jasmine changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple burgundy dress that worked for anything from coffee shops to upscale restaurants. She had no idea where Henry Porter took women to dinner, and the uncertainty made her question why she'd agreed to this at all. When he texted asking for her address, she almost suggested meeting somewhere public instead. Letting him pick her up felt too much like a real date, and she wasn't ready to call this that. But something about his voice when he called to tell her about canceling the project, something raw and uncertain, made her type her address before she could overthink it. At 7 p.m. exactly, there was a soft knock at her apartment door. Not the confident rap she'd expected from a man used to commanding attention, but something almost hesitant. Jasmine opened the door to find Henry Porter looking nothing like the polished businessman from the gala or even the overdressed observer from this morning's neighborhood tour. He wore dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, no tie, sleeves rolled up to his forearms. His hair was slightly mussed, like he'd been running his hands through it. "Hi," he said, and she heard nerves in his voice. "Hi," she replied, studying his face. "You look different." "Good different or bad different?" Different, Jasmine said, grabbing her jacket. "Jury's still out on good or bad." Henry's laugh was surprised and genuine. "Fair enough." Instead of the sleek Mercedes from this morning, a regular yellow taxi waited at the curb. Henry opened the door for her, and as they settled into the back seat, Jasmine realized she had no idea what to expect from this evening. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere in your neighborhood," Henry said. "I figured you could show me what good food actually looks like around here." Jasmine directed the driver to La Rosa, a small Dominican restaurant tucked between a barbershop and a vintage clothing store. The kind of place with mismatched chairs and family photos covering the walls, where the menu was handwritten in both Spanish and English. "This okay?" she asked as they got out of the taxi. Henry looked at the restaurant's simple storefront, then at her face. Perfect, he said, and meant it. Inside, the owner, Carlos, greeted Jasmine with a warm hug in rapid Spanish that made her laugh. He eyed Henry with polite curiosity, but didn't ask questions, just led them to a corner table lit by candles stuck in wine bottles. Carlos doesn't speak much English, Jasmine explained, but his wife Maria makes the best mofongo in the city. I'll trust your judgment, Henry said, realizing it was the first time in years he'd let someone else make decisions about his evening. As they waited for their food, an awkward silence settled between them. In the soft candlelight, surrounded by the low murmur of conversations in Spanish and the sounds of sizzling from the kitchen, they were just two people who barely knew each other, trying to figure out what they were doing here. So, Jasmine said finally, "When did you decide you wanted to be the kind of person who destroys neighborhoods for a living?" Henry nearly choked on his water. That's quite an opening question. I figure we might as well get the important stuff out of the way early, Jasmine said, her tone light, but her eyes serious. Most people spend first dates talking about movies and favorite foods. We've already established that you're willing to displace 2,000 people for profit, and I'm willing to throw champagne at strangers. Might as well dig deeper. Fair point, Henry said, appreciating her directness more than he'd expected. I grew up poor, really poor. The kind of poor where you wear the same clothes to school every day and pretend you're not hungry when other kids are eating lunch. Jasmine's expression softened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. I told myself that everything I did was about making sure I'd never be powerless again. Never be at the mercy of landlords or employers or anyone who could take away what little security I had. Henry stared at the candle flame as he spoke. Somewhere along the way, not being powerless became being the most powerful person in a room. And being the most powerful person in the room became this. Destroying communities like the one you came from? Yeah, Henry said quietly. I became everything I used to hate. The difference is I convinced myself it was justified because I was good at it. Because I was successful. Maria appeared with plates of fragrant food. Mofongo with garlic shrimp, sweet plantains, rice and beans that smelled like comfort itself. Henry watched Jasmine thank Maria in Spanish. Notice how the older woman's face lit up when Jasmine asked about her grandchildren. What about you? Henry asked as they began eating. When did you decide to become the kind of person who throws champagne at businessmen? Jasmine smiled. That was actually a first. You should feel special. I do, Henry said, and something in his tone made her look up from her plate. I became a teacher because I wanted to be the adult I needed when I was a kid, Jasmine continued, ignoring the flutter in her stomach at the way he was looking at her. Someone who saw potential instead of problems. Someone who believed that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go. But it does, though, doesn't it? Henry asked. Statistically speaking, kids from low-income neighborhoods, single-parent households, underfunded schools, the odds are stacked against them. Statistics aren't destiny, Jasmine said firmly. Every child I teach has gifts, dreams, capabilities that go way beyond whatever limitations their circumstances might suggest. My job is to help them see that in themselves. Henry found himself leaning forward, drawn in by her passion. Even when the system is designed to work against them? Especially then, Jasmine said. That's when they need someone in their corner most. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the tension from earlier dissolving into something warmer. Henry discovered that mofongo was possibly the best thing he'd ever tasted, and that watching Jasmine eat, the way she savored each bite, the soft sound of satisfaction she made when trying the plantains, was dangerously distracting. Can I ask you something? Jasmine said eventually. Shoot, why did you really cancel the project? And don't give me some line about doing the right thing. I've spent enough time around politicians and administrators to know what corporate speak sounds like. Henry set down his fork, considering his answer carefully. Around them, the restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the sounds of Maria moving around the kitchen. This felt like the most honest conversation he'd had in years. Because of Marcus, he said finally. Marcus. When he asked if I was to help you save the school, I realized I couldn't look an 8-year-old in the eye and explain why my profit margins were more important than his stability. I've spent 20 years justifying decisions by saying business is business, but business affects real people. Kids like Marcus, women like Mrs. Rodriguez. Jasmine studied his face in the candlelight. People like you used to be. Yeah, Henry admitted. People like I used to be. So what happens now? You walk away from $200 million and hope your investors don't destroy you. Henry's laugh was rueful. Something like that. Though I'm not sure hope is the right word. More like prepare for battle. Any regrets? Henry looked at her across the small table, at the way the candlelight played across her features, at the genuine interest in her dark eyes. Ask me tomorrow, he said, after the board meeting where I explain why I just killed our. That's going to be ugly. Probably, Henry agreed. But I'm more worried about something else. What? Whether this dinner ends with you deciding I'm just another rich guy trying to buy his way into feeling good about himself. Jasmine was quiet for a moment, considering. Is that what you're doing? No, Henry said, his voice low and certain. I'm trying to figure out why a woman I barely know has made me question everything I thought I wanted out of life. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken at the intensity in his voice, at the way he was looking at her like she was the most interesting thing he'd ever encountered. Henry, she said carefully, I'm not looking for complications. Neither am I, he replied, leaning slightly closer. But I think we're past that now. The space between them seemed to shrink. Jasmine could smell his cologne, something clean and expensive, but not overwhelming. Could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the way his gaze dropped briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. This is crazy, she whispered. Completely, he agreed, his voice rough. When he kissed her, it was nothing like she'd expected from a man with his reputation. It was tentative at first, almost shy, like he was asking permission for something he'd forgotten how to request. When she responded, her lips parting under his, he made a sound low in his throat that sent heat spiraling through her entire body. They broke apart slowly, breathing hard, staring at each other across the small table. We should probably get the check, Henry said, his voice unsteady. Probably, Jasmine agreed, but neither of them moved to signal Carlos. What's more powerful, when someone sees your public success or when they recognize your private struggles? Tell me about someone who truly saw you. The walk back to her apartment building was charged with electricity. Every accidental brush of their hands, every shared glance, felt loaded with possibility. When they reached her front door, Jasmine turned to face him, keys in her hand. I had a good time tonight, she said. So did I, Henry replied. Better than good. They stood there on her doorstep, both aware that this was a decision point. Invite him up, or let him go home and pretend this was just dinner between two people with nothing in common. I'm not looking for complications, Jasmine said again, but her voice was less certain than before. Neither am I, Henry said, stepping closer. But I can't stop thinking about you. The confession was raw, honest, completely unlike the smooth businessman she'd expected him to be. Standing there in the dim light of her building's entrance, he looked younger somehow, less sure of himself. I don't do this, Jasmine said quietly. I don't bring men home. I don't get involved with people whose lives are so different from mine. Then why are you considering it? Henry asked gently. Jasmine looked up at him, at the man who had walked away from a fortune because an 8-year-old boy asked him to help save a school, who had let her choose the restaurant and order for both of them, who kissed like he was grateful for the privilege. Because, she said, surprising herself with the honesty, you see me, really see me, not just the teacher, not just the activist, me. That's when Henry cupped her face in his hands and kissed her again, deeper this time, with none of the hesitation from the restaurant. Jasmine felt herself melting into him, her careful boundaries dissolving under the heat of his attention. When they broke apart, she was breathing hard and her keys were shaking in her hand. Come upstairs, she said before she could change her mind. As they climbed the 3 flights to her apartment, Jasmine's heart hammered against her ribs. She was about to cross a line she'd never crossed before, with a man she barely knew but was already falling for in ways that terrified her. Standing outside her apartment door, keys finally steady in her hand, she looked back at Henry one more time. "Last chance to change your mind," she said. "I'm not changing my mind," Henry said, his eyes dark with want and something deeper. "Are you?" Instead of answering, Jasmine unlocked her door and pulled him inside. As they stood on her doorstep, keys in her hand, she faced a choice that terrified her more than any confrontation: invite him up or protect the careful life she'd built. "I'm not looking for complications," she whispered. "Neither am I," he said, stepping closer. "But I think we're past that now." The most powerful man in Manhattan stood in her tiny apartment like he belonged there, and for the first time in her life, she wanted someone to stay. Jasmine's apartment was small but warm, filled with books and student artwork and photographs of family gatherings. Henry took it all in: the mismatched furniture that somehow worked perfectly together, the throw pillows that had seen better days but felt like home, the kitchen table covered with paper she'd been grading. "This is me," she said, suddenly self-conscious about the contrast between his world and hers. "Not much, but it's mine." Henry turned from studying a bulletin board covered with thank you notes from students and their parents. "It's perfect," he said, and meant it. There was something about this space that made him feel more relaxed than his penthouse ever had. Maybe it was the way everything served a purpose beyond just looking expensive. Maybe it was the evidence everywhere of a life lived in service to others. Or maybe it was just her, moving through the space with easy familiarity, offering him wine from a bottle that cost less than what he usually spent on lunch. "So," Jasmine said, settling onto her couch with her glass, "tell me about the board meeting tomorrow." Henry sat beside her, close enough to catch that subtle scent of her perfume again. "You really want to know? I asked, didn't I? They're going to try to have me removed as CEO," Henry said simply. 20 years of building this company, and they'll vote me out because I chose principle over profit. Jasmine studied his face. "You don't seem worried." "I'm terrified," Henry admitted, "but not about losing the job, about what it means if I don't." "What do you mean?" Henry set down his wine and turned to face her fully. "If I can't stand up to my own board about something this important, what does that say about who I really am? If I back down now, I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I chose money over doing what's right. And if you don't back down, then I lose everything I've worked for and hope it was worth it." Jasmine reached over and took his hand, her fingers warm against his palm. "It's worth it," she said quietly. "What you're protecting, those families, those kids, it's worth more than any amount of money." Henry looked down at their joined hands, surprised by how natural it felt. "You really believe that?" "I know that," Jasmine said. "I see it every day. I see what happens when kids have stability, when families have homes they can count on. I see what gets destroyed when they don't." The conviction in her voice made something tight in Henry's chest loosen. For 20 years, he'd made decisions in boardrooms surrounded by people who measured success only in dollars a market share. Sitting here with Jasmine, he remembered why those numbers were supposed to matter in the first place. "Can I ask you something?" Henry said. "Sure." "When you threw that champagne at me, did you think it would change anything? Or were you just so angry you couldn't help yourself?" Jasmine laughed, the sound filling her small living room. "Honestly, I was furious. I'd spent 3 months trying to get meetings with your company, sending emails, making phone calls, getting nowhere. Then I had to watch you stand up there talking about revitalization like displacement was some kind of gift to the community. So it was anger." "It was anger," Jasmine agreed. "But it was also hope, I guess. Hope that maybe if I could make you see us as real people instead of just obstacles to your development plans, you might choose differently." "Did you think it would work?" "No," Jasmine said honestly. "Rich men don't usually change their minds because teachers get upset with them. But I had to try. Those kids deserve someone willing to fight for them, even if the fight seems impossible." Henry brought their joined hands to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was so gentle, so unexpected, that Jasmine felt her breath catch. "What was that for?" she asked. "For being brave enough to hope," Henry said. "For seeing something in me worth fighting for, even when I didn't see it myself. The air between them shifted, becoming charged with something deeper than simple attraction. Jasmine looked at this man who had walked away from a fortune because she'd challenged him to be better, who was risking his career to protect people he barely knew. "Henry," she said softly. "Yeah, I want to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to know I don't do this. I don't let people in." Henry's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Then why me?" Jasmine looked up at him, honest and afraid. "Because you see me, really see me. Not just the teacher, not just the activist. Me." That's when Henry kissed her, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. His mouth was sure and warm, and when Jasmine responded, opening to him, he made a sound low in his throat that sent heat racing through her entire body. They broke apart, breathing hard, staring at each other in the dim light of her living room. "Are you sure?" Henry asked, his voice rough. Instead of answering with words, Jasmine took his hand and led him toward her bedroom. Her bedroom was as personal as the rest of her apartment. Books stacked on the nightstand, a quilt her grandmother had made spread across the bed, photographs of family and friends clustered on the dresser. Henry took it all in, this intimate glimpse into her private world. "You can still change your mind," Jasmine said, suddenly nervous. Henry turned from the photographs to look at her, his eyes dark with want and something deeper. "I'm not changing my mind," he said. "Are you?" "No," Jasmine said, stepping closer to him. "I'm not." When she reached for the buttons of his shirt, her hands were steady. When he helped her out of her dress, his movements were reverent, like he was unwrapping something precious. "You're beautiful," he whispered against her skin, and the way he said it, like he was sharing a secret, made her believe him. Their lovemaking was different from what Jasmine had expected. There was passion, yes, but also tenderness, patience, the kind of attention that made her feel truly seen. Henry touched her like he was memorizing every curve, every response, every soft sound she made. "Is this okay?" he asked when she arched against him. And the fact that he asked, that her pleasure mattered to him as much as his own, undid something in her chest. "Yes," she breathed, surprised by how much she meant it. "Yes." Afterward, they lay tangled in her sheets, city lights filtering through her thin curtains. Henry traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, while Jasmine listened to his heartbeat slow back to normal. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Henry admitted. "Tomorrow I might lose my job. Next week I might lose my company. But right now, none of that matters." "What does matter?" Henry pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "This. You. The fact that you made me remember who I wanted to be before I got so caught up in who I thought I had to be." Jasmine lifted her head to look at him. "And who did you want to be?" "Someone worth knowing," Henry said simply. "Someone who used his advantages to help rather than harm. Someone who could look at himself in the mirror and feel proud of what he saw." "You are worth knowing," Jasmine said fiercely. "The fact that you're willing to risk everything to do what's right proves that." Henry cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "You have no idea what you've given me." "What have I given you?" "A reason to be better," Henry said. "A reason to fight for something that matters." When did you last feel truly seen by someone? When someone looked past your roles to find the real you. Share that feeling. As dawn crept through her bedroom windows, Jasmine drifted towards sleep in Henry's arms, feeling safer and more complete than she had in years. But even as contentment settled over her, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings about the morning, about what would happen when this perfect bubble of intimacy met the harsh realities of their different worlds. Henry lay awake longer, watching her sleep, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. In a few hours, he would face the most important board meeting of his career. He would either emerge victorious, having convinced his investors that some things mattered more than profit, or he would lose everything he'd spent 20 years building. Either way, he knew his life had changed irrevocably. The woman sleeping against his chest had shown him a version of himself he'd forgotten existed, and there was no going back to who he'd been before. His phone buzzed with a text message from his assistant. Emergency board meeting moved to 8 a.m. They're bringing in lawyers. Henry closed his eyes, knowing that the fight for his professional life was about to begin. But as Jasmine stirred in her sleep, her hand curling against his chest, he also knew what he was fighting for was worth any price they might demand. Wrapped in her sheets, as dawn crept through the windows, Henry whispered something that changed everything. "I'm canceling the project." Before she could process what that meant, for the community, for his business, for them, his phone buzzed with messages that would threaten to tear apart what they'd just begun to build. Saving her neighborhood cost him $20 million. Losing her would cost him everything that mattered. Henry's phone had been buzzing nonstop since 6 a.m. By the time Jasmine woke up, he was sitting on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, scrolling through an endless stream of angry messages from board members, investors, and business partners. "How bad is it?" she asked, pulling the sheet up to cover herself. Henry looked back at her, his hair still messy from her fingers, his shirt wrinkled from spending the night on her bedroom floor. In the morning light streaming through her windows, the contrast between his expensive clothes and her simple apartment seemed starker somehow. "Bad," he said simply. "They're calling an emergency vote to remove me as CEO. 3 major investors have already threatened to pull out. The construction crew is demanding payment for prep work they can't complete." Jasmine sat up, fully awake now. "Because you canceled one project?" "Because I canceled a $200 million project without consulting the board. Because I made what they're calling an emotional decision that could cost the company its reputation for reliable development." "Emotional decision," Jasmine repeated, hearing the dismissal in those words. "Is that what they think this was?" Henry stood up and walked to her bedroom window, looking out at the neighborhood he'd chosen to protect instead of demolish. "They think I'm having some kind of midlife crisis, that I got seduced by a community activist and lost my business sense." The words hung in the room like smoke. Jasmine felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Is that what you think?" she asked quietly. Henry turned around quickly. "No. God, no. Jasmine, what happened between us?" "Happened after you made the decision," she finished. "I know, but do they?" Henry's silence was answer enough. Jasmine got out of bed and started getting dressed, her movements sharp with sudden anger. "So I'm a distraction. The woman who led the successful businessman astray." "That's not how I see it." "But that's how they see it," Jasmine said, pulling on yesterday's clothes. "That's how it's going to look in the papers, in the board meeting, in whatever story they tell to explain why Henry Porter suddenly grew a conscience." Henry wanted to deny it, but they both knew she was right. His relationship with her, whatever this was, would be reduced to a convenient explanation for what his board saw as a catastrophic lapse in judgment. "I should go," Jasmine said, looking anywhere but at him. "Don't," Henry said, moving toward her. "Please, don't let them ruin what we—" "What we what?" Jasmine interrupted. "What we started. This was one night, Henry. One dinner and one night. That's about a cost of your career." "I don't care about my career." "Well, I do," Jasmine said, and the vehemence in her voice surprised them both. "I care that a good man is about to lose everything he's worked for because he tried to do the right thing. I care that my community is going to get blamed for destroying a business empire. I care that every headline about this is going to paint me as some kind of seductress who manipulated a powerful man." Henry reached for her hands, but she pulled away. "Jasmine, listen to me." "No, you listen," she said, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea what this is going to look like? Poor black teacher takes down rich white CEO. The story writes itself, and none of it's going to be true, but that won't matter." Henry felt something cold grip his chest as he realized what she was saying. "You think I can't handle the pressure?" "I think you shouldn't have to," Jasmine said softly. "I think maybe we moved too fast, got caught up in something that felt good without thinking about what it would cost." "The only thing that's going to cost me anything is losing you," Henry said desperately. "Everything else, the company, the money, the reputation, none of that matters if you're not in my life." Jasmine looked at him for a long moment, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the fear that he was about to lose something he just found. Part of her wanted to believe him. Part of her wanted to stay and fight alongside him, regardless of the consequences. But the bigger part, the part that had learned to be practical, to think about long-term consequences, to protect the people she cared about, knew better. "It matters to me," she said quietly. "Your life's work matters to me. The employees who depend on your company matter to me. And if there's a chance that stepping away now could save your career, then that's what I have to do. You don't get to make that choice for me," Henry said, his voice rough with frustration. "And you don't get to make it for me either," Jasmine replied. "You don't get to decide that I'm worth destroying your life over. We barely know each other, Henry. What we had last night was beautiful, but it was one night." The words hit Henry like physical blows. "Is that really what you think? That this was just one night that got out of hand?" Jasmine forced herself to meet his eyes. "I think it was the beginning of something that could have been amazing under different circumstances. But these aren't different circumstances. These are the circumstances we have."
Henry's phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the tension in the room. He glanced at the screen, his assistant probably calling about the emergency board meeting. "Answer it," Jasmine said. "Go save your company." "I'm not giving up on this," Henry said, even as he reached for his phone. "I'm not giving up on us." "There is no us to give up on," Jasmine said, and hated how the words tasted in her mouth. "They're just two people who met at the wrong time and made choices that felt right in the moment." Have you ever run from something good because it scared you how much you wanted it? Drop a heart if you've been there. Henry answered his phone, his eyes never leaving Jasmine's face as his assistant's panicked voice filled the room with talk of lawyers and emergency votes and damage control. By the time he finished the call, Jasmine was gone. He found a note on her kitchen table, written in the same careful handwriting he'd seen on her lesson plans. "Some fights are worth losing everything for. Some fights aren't worth the cost to everyone else. Thank you for being willing to fight for us, even if I can't let you." Henry sat in her empty apartment, surrounded by the evidence of her life, student photos, family pictures, books about education and social justice, and realized that losing his company would hurt far less than losing her. His phone buzzed with another message from his assistant. "Board meeting in 1 hour. Legal says if you don't show, they'll vote you out anyway." Henry stood up, straightened his tie, and prepared to fight the most important battle of his professional life. But as he walked toward the door, he knew that no matter what happened in that boardroom, he'd already lost the only thing that really mattered. The letter slipped under her apartment door was simple. "He's using you to clean up his image. Ask him about the Riverside project." 3 sentences that made her blood run cold, because she'd never heard of Riverside, and Henry had promised her complete honesty. The man who'd sworn to tell her everything had kept the one secret that could destroy them both. 3 days had passed since Jasmine walked out of her own apartment to avoid watching Henry's world collapse because of her. 3 days of throwing herself into lesson plans and parent conferences and anything else that might stop her from checking the news for updates about Porter Development Group. It didn't work. She knew about the board meeting that had lasted 6 hours. Knew about the investor revolt that had cost the company $40 million in backing. Knew about the headlines calling Henry's decision everything from corporate responsibility to business suicide. What she didn't know was why someone had slipped an envelope under her door at midnight, or why her hand was shaking as she stared at the single sheet of paper inside. Ask Henry Porter about the Riverside project. Ask him how many families he displaced before he found his conscience. Ask him why your neighborhood is worth saving when Riverside wasn't. Below the typed message was a photocopied newspaper clipping from 5 years ago. Porter Development completes Riverside renovation, displaces 500 families. And below that, a photograph of Henry at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, smiling as he stood next to a gleaming glass building. Jasmine read the clipping 3 times, her heart sinking further with each word. The Riverside project had been Henry's biggest success before Crown Heights, an urban renewal initiative that had transformed a working-class neighborhood into luxury condos and upscale retail. The article praised his vision, his ability to maximize underutilized urban space. It sounded exactly like the speech he'd been giving the night she threw champagne in his face. By morning, Jasmine had found 6 more articles about Riverside. Stories about families forced out by rising rents. Small businesses closing because they couldn't afford the new commercial rates. A community center that had served the neighborhood for 20 years, demolished to make room for a boutique hotel. All of it Henry's doing. All of it exactly what he'd promised wouldn't happen to Crown Heights. Jasmine sat in her empty classroom before school started, staring at the newspaper clippings spread across her desk. She felt sick, betrayed, and incredibly foolish. How many times had Henry told her he understood what his developments did to communities? How many times had she believed him when he said Crown Heights was different? Her phone rang. Henry's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment she considered not answering. But she needed to hear his voice when she asked him about this. She needed to know if he would lie to her face. Jasmine. Henry's voice sounded tired, relieved. Thank God. I've been trying to reach you for 3 days. I've been busy, Jasmine said, her tone carefully neutral. I know you're trying to protect me, but running away isn't. Tell me about Riverside, Jasmine interrupted. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Jasmine, Henry said finally, and she could hear the resignation in his voice. Where did you? Does it matter where I heard about it? What matters is that you didn't tell me. What matters is that you stood in my neighborhood talking about how you finally understood what development did to communities, and you'd already done it before. To 500 families. It's not that simple. Then explain it to me, Jasmine said, standing up and beginning to pace around her classroom. Explain how Crown Heights is different from Riverside. Explain how you suddenly grew a conscience between 5 years ago and 3 days ago. I didn't suddenly grow anything, Henry said, his voice growing sharper. I've been questioning what I do for years. Riverside was part of that questioning. Questioning? You displaced 500 families and called it questioning. I called it learning, Henry shot back. I called it seeing the human cost of what I've been doing and realizing I couldn't keep doing it. Jasmine stopped pacing. So Crown Heights was your redemption project? Your chance to feel better about all the communities you'd already destroyed? No, Henry said firmly. Crown Heights was my chance to do better, to make different choices. Because you met me? Because I was ready to listen when you forced me to hear you. Jasmine sank back in her desk chair, feeling exhausted and confused and angry all at once. You should have told me. From the beginning, you should have told me about Riverside. You're right, Henry said quietly. I should have. I was afraid that if you knew about my past, you'd never believe I could change. And now I don't know if you have changed or if you're just good at saying what people want to hear. Jasmine, please. Let me see you. Let me explain. There's nothing to explain, Jasmine said, and was surprised by how calm her voice sounded. You did what you always do. You saw what you wanted, you figured out how to get it, and you convinced yourself it was justified. That's not what happened, isn't it? You wanted Crown Heights. You met resistance from the community, so you changed tactics. Instead of bulldozing through opposition, you seduced it. I fell in love with you, Henry said, his voice raw. That wasn't tactics. That wasn't strategy. That was just you. The words hit Jasmine like a physical blow. Love. He'd said love. Don't, she whispered. Don't say that. Why not? It's true. Because it makes this worse, Jasmine said, tears she hadn't realized were coming now, streaming down her face. Because if you really loved me, you would have trusted me with the truth. All of it. I was trying to protect what we had. You were trying to control what we had. Just like you controlled Riverside. Just like you tried to control Crown Heights. People aren't projects, Henry. Communities aren't problems to be solved or obstacles to be managed. I know that now. Do you? Or do you just know how to say it in a way that sounds convincing? The question hung between them like a chasm. Jasmine could hear Henry breathing on the other end of the line, could picture him in his office or his penthouse or wherever powerful men went when their carefully constructed worlds started falling apart. I don't know how to prove it to you, he said finally. I don't know how to make you believe that you changed me, that meeting you made me want to be better than I was. You can't, Jasmine said softly. That's the problem, Henry. I can't trust my own feelings about you anymore, and I can't trust yours about me. Too much has happened. Too many secrets. So that's it. We're done because I didn't tell you about every mistake I made before I met you. We're done because those mistakes aren't history. They're who you are, and I can't be with someone I don't trust, no matter how much I might want to. When was the last time you had to choose between what you wanted and what you knew was right? Share your story in the comments. Jasmine ended the call before Henry could respond, before she could change her mind, before the sound of his voice could convince her to forgive what felt unforgivable. She sat in her empty classroom, surrounded by the bright colors and optimistic energy of children's artwork, and cried for what felt like the first time in years. She cried for Henry, for the man he might have been if he'd chosen differently 5 years ago. She cried for herself, for falling in love with someone whose past made their future impossible. And she cried for the communities like Riverside, whose stories have been buried under gleaming new developments and press releases about urban improvement. Her students started arriving 20 minutes later, and Jasmine wiped her eyes, fixed her smile, and prepared to spend another day teaching children that their dreams mattered, that their voices had power, that sometimes fighting for what was right meant accepting losses you never saw coming. But even as she greeted Marcus and listened to his excited chatter about a book he'd finished over the weekend, part of her heart remained in that phone conversation, wondering if she'd just walked away from the only man who'd ever made her believe in second chances. Outside her classroom window, construction crews were breaking ground on a new luxury development 6 blocks away. The sound of progress continued its relentless march through the city, and Jasmine couldn't help but wonder how many families would be displaced this time, and whether anyone would throw champagne at the developer responsible. The man who'd sworn to tell her everything had kept the one secret that could destroy them both. And now they were both paying the price for truths that came too late and trust that had been broken before it fully formed. Rain-soaked confrontation in her school parking lot, his car's headlights cutting through darkness, her standing in the downpour refusing his umbrella. How many other neighborhoods, Henry? How many other families did you scatter to build your empire? That was before I knew better. Before I knew you. I'm not your redemption story. I'm not your chance to feel better about the damage you've done. She invited him to her world not as a visitor, but as a challenge. Prove you want me, not just what I represent. For 2 weeks, Henry tried everything. Flowers delivered to her school were returned unopened. Text messages went unanswered. Phone calls rolled straight to voicemail. He even tried showing up at La Rosa, the little Dominican restaurant where they'd had their first real conversation, hoping she might appear. She didn't. What finally got her attention was the headline in the New York Times. Porter Development CEO establishes foundation for displaced communities, begins with Riverside reparations. Jasmine read the article 3 times over her morning coffee, trying to process what Henry had done. He'd liquidated personal assets to create a $50 million fund specifically for families affected by his past developments. The first recipients would be former Riverside residents, with Crown Heights families receiving guaranteed assistance if any future development threats emerged. It was exactly the kind of gesture that could be seen as either genuine repentance or elaborate public relations. The cynic in Jasmine wondered which one it was. The part of her that remembered how he'd looked at Marcus, how he'd listened to Mrs. Rodriguez's story, hoped it was real. Her phone rang during lunch break. Henry's name on the screen. This time, she answered. "I saw the article," she said without preamble. "I was hoping you would." Henry's voice was careful, controlled. "Can we talk?" "We are talking. I mean in person. There are things I need to say that can't be said over the phone." Jasmine looked around her empty classroom, at the student artwork covering every available surface, at the pictures of her kids that reminded her daily why this work mattered. "Come to my school," she said. "After classes end. 4:30. Jasmine, if you want to talk to me, you come to my world. On my terms." Henry was quiet for a moment. "Okay, 4:30. When he arrived, Jasmine was in the school garden with a small group of students who stayed late for the after-school program. She watched through the classroom window as his car pulled up. Not the Mercedes this time, but a simple sedan that didn't scream wealth and privilege. He waited by the school's front entrance, not pushing, not demanding attention, just standing there in his perfectly tailored suit looking completely out of place and somehow comfortable with that fact. Ms. Williams' 7-year-old Sophia tugged on her sleeve. "There's a man in a fancy suit waiting for you." "I see him, sweetheart. Can you help Marcus clean up the art supplies while I go talk to him?" "Is he your boyfriend?" Sophia asked with the directness of childhood. He's complicated, Jasmine said. My mom says all the good ones are complicated, Sophia replied sagely, then skipped off to help Marcus. Jasmine walked toward Henry, noting how he straightened when he saw her coming, how his eyes tracked her movement with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her resolve to stay detached. You came, she said. You asked me to. Henry's voice was quieter than she remembered, less commanding. Thank you for seeing me. Don't thank me yet. We haven't talked. They walked to a small seating area near the school's playground, plastic chairs arranged around a picnic table that had seen better days. Henry sat across from her, his expensive clothes a stark contrast to the elementary school furniture. The foundation, Jasmine began. Is it real or is it damage control? It's real, Henry said without hesitation. It's also damage control. Both things can be true. His honesty surprised her. She'd expected him to insist his motives were purely altruistic. Explain that. Henry looked out at the playground where a few children were still playing, their laughter carrying across the afternoon air. When I started the foundation, part of me was trying to win you back. I won't lie about that. But the bigger part was trying to live with myself. Live with what exactly? With the knowledge that I spent 20 years prioritizing profit over people. With the faces of families I displaced, communities I destroyed. With the fact that it took falling in love with you to make me see what I'd been doing. Jasmine felt something shift in her chest at his casual mention of love, but she forced herself to stay focused. So, this is about your guilt. This is about responsibility, Henry corrected. Guilt is a feeling. Responsibility is an action. The foundation is me taking action to repair what I can repair. And what about what you can't repair? What about the communities that are gone, the businesses that closed, the families that were scattered? Henry met her eyes directly. I can't undo the past. I can only try to do better going forward. But doing better means acknowledging what I did wrong, even when it's uncomfortable. Jasmine studied his face, looking for signs of the polished businessman who could say anything to close a deal. What she saw instead was exhaustion, sincerity, and something that looked like hope. The board fired you, she said. It wasn't a question. 3 days after our last phone call. Unanimous vote of no confidence. I'm sorry. I'm not, Henry said, and meant it. Losing that job was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to figure out who I am when I'm not hiding behind titles and bank accounts. And who are you? Henry was quiet for a long moment, watching the children play. I'm a man who made a lot of mistakes and wants to spend whatever time he has left making better choices. I'm someone who fell in love with a woman who made him remember what integrity looks like. Henry, I'm someone who understands if that love isn't enough to bridge the gap between who I was and who I'm trying to become. The vulnerability in his voice undid something in Jasmine's carefully constructed defenses. This wasn't the confident CEO who had commanded attention at the Plaza Hotel Gala. This was just a man, flawed and honest, asking for something he wasn't sure he deserved. Have you ever had someone see your worth when you couldn't? Drop a heart in the comments if you've experienced that moment. The foundation is a good start, Jasmine said carefully. But starting over isn't just about money. It's about trust. And trust takes time to rebuild. How much time? Henry asked. I don't know. Maybe a lot. Maybe more than you're willing to invest in someone who might never be able to forgive your past. Henry reached across the picnic table and covered her hand with his. I have nothing but time, Jasmine. The question is whether you're willing to let me try to earn what I should have protected in the first place. Jasmine looked down at their joined hands, remembering the night he'd spent in her apartment, the way he'd touched her like she was precious. She thought about the Riverside families who would benefit from his foundation, about the Crown Heights community that was safe because he'd chosen principle over profit. She thought about second chances, about the forgiveness she taught her students to offer each other, about whether love could survive the collision of two very different worlds. Dinner, she said finally. Saturday night. Here in my neighborhood. We start over, slowly, and see what happens. Henry's smile was like sunrise. I like that very much. As he walked back to his car, Jasmine watched from the school steps, wondering if she was making the smartest decision or the most foolish one of her life. Maybe she thought they were the same thing. She invited him to her world, not as a visitor, but as a challenge. Prove you want me, not just what I represent. Saturday would be the first test of whether he was up for the challenge. People say love bridges different worlds, but nobody tells you how terrifying it is to stand in the middle, wondering if the bridge will hold. Saturday night came with October rain and second thoughts. Jasmine changed clothes twice before settling on jeans and a sweater that said she wasn't trying too hard but still cared enough to make an effort. Henry had texted asking if he should bring anything, and she'd told him just to bring himself. Now she wondered if that had been a mistake. At 7 p.m. sharp, there was a knock at her apartment door. When she opened it, Henry stood there holding a single sunflower and looking nervous in a way that made her heart skip. "You said not to bring anything," he said, offering her the flower, but showing up empty-handed felt wrong. "It's perfect," Jasmine said, accepting the sunflower and noting that he'd remembered her mentioning they were her favorite during their first dinner. "Come." Henry stepped into her apartment, and this time Jasmine saw it through his eyes. The small space, the second-hand furniture, the evidence of a life lived paycheck to paycheck. Instead of judgment, she saw something that looked like contentment cross his face. "I miss this place," he said simply. "You were here once. Once was enough to know it feels more like home than anywhere I've ever lived." The honesty in his voice made Jasmine's resolve to keep things casual waver slightly. She busied herself putting the sunflower in a mason jar filled with water, trying to ignore how domestic the gesture felt. "So," she said, turning back to him, "how does this work? Starting over?" "I was hoping you'd tell me," Henry said. "I've never had to rebuild trust with someone who mattered this much before." "Most people who matter don't get the chance to rebuild," Jasmine pointed out. "They get written off after the first major betrayal." "Then why am I here?" Jasmine considered the question seriously. "Because you did something I didn't expect. You took responsibility without making excuses. You took action without being asked. And because," she paused, struggling with the admission, "because I can't stop thinking about who you might be if you really have changed. And if I haven't, if this is all just an elaborate way to win you back, then I'll know eventually, and it'll hurt worse than it does now. But I'd rather risk being wrong about your potential than be right about your limitations." Henry moved closer to her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "What do you need from me to believe that this is real?" "Time," Jasmine said immediately. "Consistency. Proof that your choices come from conviction, not just attraction to me." "What kind of proof?" Before Jasmine could answer, her phone rang with her mother's ringtone. She glanced apologetically at Henry. "I should take this. Mom only calls during dinner if it's important." "Jasmine, baby." Her mother's voice was tight with worry. "Are you watching news?" "No, what?" "That man you were seeing, the businessman, he's on Channel 7. Something about his company and a lawsuit." Jasmine looked at Henry, who had gone very still. "Mom, can I call you back?" She turned on her small television, flipping to the local news. Henry's face filled the screen, an old photo from his corporate days, confident and polished. The news anchor's voice filled her apartment. Former Porter Development Group CEO Henry Porter is facing a class-action lawsuit from residents of the Riverside neighborhood, who claim his company's development practices 5 years ago violated tenant protection laws and housing regulations. The suit, filed today, seeks $200 million in damages. Jasmine muted the television and turned to Henry, who was staring at the screen with an expression she couldn't read. "Did you know this was coming?" she asked quietly. "I suspected it might," Henry said. "When I established the foundation, my lawyers warned me that admitting responsibility could open me up to legal action. And you did it anyway." "I did it anyway." Jasmine studied his face, looking for signs of regret or panic. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like relief. "Why?" she asked. "Because legal consequences are better than moral ones. Because money can be earned back, but integrity can't. Because if I have to choose between protecting my bank account and protecting my ability to sleep at night, the choice is obvious. The conviction in his voice made something tight in Jasmine's chest loosen. This wasn't the calculated response of a man trying to minimize damage. This was someone who had genuinely accepted the cost of doing what was right. "This could destroy you financially," she said. "Probably," Henry agreed. "The foundation ate up most of my liquid assets. If they win this lawsuit, I'll lose pretty much everything else. And that doesn't scare you?" Henry was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "It terrifies me," he said finally, "but not as much as the alternative. Not as much as going back to being someone who prioritized money over people." Jasmine's phone rang again, this time with a number she didn't recognize. "Don't answer it," Henry said quickly. "It's probably reporters. They've been calling everyone connected to me, trying to get statements." "Connected to you?" "Your name came up during the deposition prep. Someone at the Plaza Gala remembered you confronting me. The lawyers think you might be called as a witness." Jasmine felt cold suddenly. "A witness to what?" "To my state of mind when I made business decisions. To whether my relationship with you influenced my choice to cancel Crown Heights." The implications hit her like physical blows. Her private life, her relationship with Henry, their night together, all of it could become public record, dissected by lawyers and reported in newspapers and reduced to evidence in a legal case. "I should go," Henry said quietly, seeing the panic in her eyes. "I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't have put you in this position." "No," Jasmine said quickly, surprising herself. "No, don't go. Jasmine, this is going to get ugly. You don't want to be associated with me right now." "That's not your choice to make," she said firmly. "And it's not your decision whether I can handle the consequences of being with you." Henry looked at her with something that might have been hope. "Being with me? Starting over with you," Jasmine corrected, but her voice was softer now. Slowly, carefully. "Despite the lawyers and the lawsuits and the reporters who are going to try to make our story into something it's not." "What?" Jasmine walked over to him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of responsibility he'd been carrying alone. "Because watching you choose principle over profit, even when it costs you everything, tells me more about who you really are than any secret from your past ever could." When she kissed him, it was different from their first kisses, less desperate, more certain. It tasted like forgiveness and possibility and the kind of second chances that had to be earned rather than given. "So what happens now?" Henry asked against her lips. "Now we figure out how to build something real while the whole world is watching," Jasmine said. "Think you're up for that challenge? Have you ever felt like you were living in two different worlds? How did you bridge that gap? Share your experience." Henry's answer was to kiss her again, deeper this time, with the kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly what he was choosing and why. Outside, the October rain continued to fall, washing the city clean and preparing the ground for whatever would grow in the spring. Neither of them knew what the lawsuit would bring or how the media attention would affect their carefully rebuilding relationship. But as they stood in Jasmine's small apartment, surrounded by evidence of a life built on principle rather than profit, both of them felt something they hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. The phone continued to ring, reporters, lawyers, concerned friends, but they ignored it all. Tonight was about them, about choosing each other despite the complications, about building a bridge between their worlds that could withstand whatever storms were coming. People say love bridges different worlds, but nobody tells you how terrifying it is to stand in the middle, wondering if the bridge will hold. As Jasmine led Henry toward her couch, both of them knew they were about to find out whether what they'd built was strong enough to survive the test of time, legal scrutiny, and public judgment. The answer would determine not just their future together, but who they both became in the process of fighting for it. They say money can't buy redemption, but what happens when someone who destroyed lives tries to rebuild them? 3 months after the courtroom drama, Henry stood in a half-gutted building in Harlem, sweat dripping down his back as he measured wooden beams. The Porter Foundation wasn't just a tax write-off anymore. It had become his lifeline back to humanity. "You're holding that level wrong," Jasmine called from across the room, her voice echoing off bare walls. She wore paint-splattered jeans and an old T-shirt, her hair tied back with a bandana. Even covered in dust, she looked more beautiful than any woman in designer gowns he'd ever known. I've never done manual labor in my life, Henry admitted, setting down the tool. My hands are more familiar with signing checks than holding hammers. Time to learn then. She walked over, her fingers covering his on the level. Feel that bubble? It needs to sit right in the center. Like trust, it only works when everything's balanced. Their first community center was taking shape in the building where Mrs. Rodriguez had once run a corner store. The neighborhood kids had already started showing up after school, curious about the renovation happening in their backyard. Mr. Henry called Marcus, a 12-year-old with gap teeth and endless energy. My mom wants to know if you're really going to teach us about money stuff. Financial literacy, Henry corrected gently. And yes, if you want to learn. Cool. She says rich people usually just take from the neighborhood. They don't get back nothing. Jasmine shot Henry a look that said everything. This is your chance to prove you're different. Have you ever tried to change who you are while everyone watches, waiting for you to fail? Henry was learning that redemption wasn't a single moment. It was showing up every day, even when your back ached and your hand were bleeding. The media hadn't been kind. Billionaire's guilt trip read one headline. Blood money charity screamed another. But the families in Harlem were starting to see something different. They saw a man who arrived at 7 in the morning and stayed until dark, who listened to their concerns about housing and jobs without checking his phone, who had somehow convinced his former business partner to fund a scholarship program instead of filing another lawsuit. You know what I realized today? Henry said as they packed up tools in the fading light. What's that? I spent 20 years building walls, financial barriers, legal protections, emotional distance. Now I'm literally tearing walls down to create something open and welcoming. There's poetry in that. Jasmine smiled. Look at you, getting all philosophical on me. You bring out sides of me I didn't know existed. Their relationship had evolved into something neither had expected. Not the fairy tale romance where opposites attract and live happily ever after, but something more complex. They challenged each other daily. She called him out when his old habits surfaced. He pushed her to dream bigger than just her classroom. But late at night, when they fell into bed exhausted from construction work and community meetings, they found peace in each other's arms that neither had ever known before. The city council meeting is tomorrow, Jasmine said, running her finger along his chest. You ready for another fight? With you beside me? I can face anything. The next evening brought their biggest test yet. The community center needed zoning approval, and not everyone in the neighborhood supported the project. Some residents worried about gentrification. Others questioned Henry's motives. How do we know this isn't just another rich man's project that'll push us out in 5 years? Demanded Mrs. Washington, a woman in her 70s who'd lived in Harlem her entire life. Henry stood up slowly. You don't know. You have every right to be suspicious. I will be too. The only thing I can offer is transparency, every dollar accounted for, every decision made with community input. And my word that if this goes wrong, you can hold me personally responsible. Your word? Scoffed a man in the back. What's that worth? Not much, based on my track record, Henry acknowledged. But I'm hoping to change that, one day at a time. Jasmine watched from the audience as Henry faced hostile questions for 2 hours. No prepared remarks, no lawyer by his side. Just honest answers about his past mistakes and uncertain promises about the future. When the vote came back 7-3 in favor, she saw tears in his eyes. That night, as they walked through the neighborhood that was slowly becoming home to both of them, Henry stopped suddenly. What is it? Jasmine asked. I love you, he said. Not because you saved me or changed me, but because you saw something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself. I love you too, she replied. All of you, the broken parts and the healing ones. Do you believe people can truly change, or are we all just variations of who we've always been? Standing on that Harlem street corner, Henry and Jasmine were about to find out. Because tomorrow would bring their biggest challenge yet, one that would test everything they'd built together. Some ghosts don't stay buried, especially when they wear expensive suits and carry briefcases full of secrets. Richard Blackwell walked into their community center like he owned it, which, technically, he once had. Henry's former business partner hadn't aged well. Stress lines carved deep around his eyes, his once perfect smile now sharp with bitterness. "Quite the little project you have here, Henry," Richard said, his voice carrying the kind of smooth menace that had once terrorized boardrooms. "Very humble." Jasmine was teaching a financial literacy class to teenagers when she noticed Henry's face drain of color. She'd never seen him look afraid before, but whatever history walked through that door had the power to destroy everything they'd built. "Richard." Henry's voice was steady, but his hands clenched into fists. "What do you want? Can't old partners catch up? Especially when one of them has become such a humanitarian." He said the word like it tasted bitter. The teenagers sensed tension immediately. Marcus, always protective of his teachers, stood up. "Everything okay, Miss Williams?" "Class dismissed early today," Jasmine said quickly. "We'll continue tomorrow." As the kids filed out, casting curious glances back, Richard's smile widened. "Smart woman. This conversation isn't for young ears." "Talk," Henry said once they were alone. "Remember the Riverside project?" "Of course you do. It made us both very wealthy. What you might not remember is the environmental impact report we buried, the one that would have stopped the whole development." Jasmine felt ice form in her stomach. "What environmental report?" Richard pulled out a thick folder. "Soil contamination, groundwater poisoning, potential health hazards for residents. We knew about it all. Henry here insisted we proceed anyway." "That's not," Henry started. "Not what?" "Not true. I have your signature on the suppression order. Your handwriting on the memo calling the health concerns acceptable losses for profit margin." The words hit Jasmine like physical blows. Acceptable losses. The families who'd gotten sick, the children with asthma, the elderly residents who died. Henry had known there might be health risks and built anyway. "Is this true?" she whispered. Henry's silence was answer enough. "You see, Jasmine, may I call you Jasmine? Your boyfriend didn't just steal money or manipulate markets. He poisoned an entire community and covered it up. My community, as it happens. I grew up 3 blocks from Riverside." Richard's revelation hit like a bomb. "You want to know why I went along with Henry's schemes for so many years? Because he promised me we'd eventually make enough money to fix the damage, clean up the contamination, fund medical treatments, relocate families if necessary. But he never intended to do any of that. Did you, Henry?" Jasmine stared at the man she'd fallen in love with, searching his face for the denial that never came. "I convinced myself it was a long-term plan," Henry said finally, "that we'd circle back after we'd maximize profits. 20 years later, and you never circled back. Not until your conscience got woke by a pretty schoolteacher." "What do you want, Richard?" Henry repeated. "Justice. Real justice. Not this performance art charity work. I want you to publicly admit what we did. I want you to pay for proper environmental cleanup. Not just the surface work, but deep soil remediation. And I want you to fund medical monitoring for every family affected. That would cost everything. Yes, your fortune, your reputation, probably your freedom when the criminal charges come." Richard's smile was cold. "But think of it as the ultimate redemption story." Jasmine found her voice. "How many people got sick? Current count? 47 confirmed cases of respiratory illness, 16 cancer diagnoses, and at least 12 deaths that could be linked to the contamination." But hey, who's counting? The numbers crushed her. While she'd been falling for Henry's transformation story, real families were still suffering from decisions he'd made decades ago. "I need time to think," Henry said. "Of course you do. You always need time when it comes to doing the right thing." Richard headed for the door. "You have 48 hours. After that, I go to the media with everything." After Richard left, the silence stretched between Henry and Jasmine like a canyon. "Say something," Henry pleaded. 12 people died." Her voice was flat, emotionless. 12 people died because you wanted bigger profits. I was a different person." "No." She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "You were the same person making different choices. And now I have to decide if I can love someone capable of those choices." "Jasmine, please. Let me explain." "Explain what? That you've been lying to me for months? That while I was celebrating your transformation, families were still living with the poison you put in their ground." She walked toward the door, then stopped. "The worst part isn't what you did 20 years ago," Henry. It's that you let me fall in love with you without telling me the truth. You let me believe in a redemption story while people were still dying from your mistakes. Where are you going? To think, and to pray that the man I love is strong enough to do what's right, even if it destroys him. The door closed behind her with a finality that felt like the end of everything they'd built together. Can love survive when the foundation it's built on cracks? Henry was about to find out. They say confession is good for the soul, but what happens when the truth might destroy everyone you care about? Henry sat alone in his penthouse for the first time in months, staring at financial statements that represented his entire life's work. 48 hours to decide between self-preservation and justice, between the woman he loved and the empire he'd built. His phone buzzed constantly. Lawyers, advisors, business associates who'd caught wind of Richard's ultimatum. They all had the same advice. Fight it. Discredit Richard. Use legal loopholes and public relations to minimize damage. But all Henry could hear was Jasmine's voice. 12 people died. At dawn, he drove to Riverside. Not the gleaming development that bore the name, but the original neighborhood they'd poisoned. The community that time forgot, where children still played on contaminated soil and families drew water from wells that should have been condemned decades ago. Mrs. Chan was watering flowers in her front yard when Henry approached. She was 83, had lived in the same house for 40 years, and didn't recognize the man who'd helped destroy her community. Beautiful garden, Henry said. Thank you. Though the roses don't grow like they used to. Soil's gone bad somehow. She shrugged with the resignation of someone who'd accepted that some things couldn't be fixed. What if someone could fix it? The soil, I mean. She laughed, a sound like dry leaves. With what money? Who's going to spend millions cleaning up a neighborhood nobody cares about? Henry wanted to tell her. Wanted to confess right there among her struggling roses and promise to make everything right. Instead, he asked, would you want it fixed, even if it meant admitting someone had hurt you? Son, when you get to be my age, you realize healing matters more than blame. If someone wanted to fix what's broken, I wouldn't ask too many questions about why. That afternoon, Henry found himself at Jasmine's apartment. She opened the door, but didn't invite him in. I called the families, she said without preamble. The ones from Riverside. Do you want to know what they told me? Jasmine. Maria Santos lost her husband to lung cancer 3 years ago. He was 48, never smoked a day in his life, but he worked construction in that neighborhood for 15 years. She's raising 2 kids alone now. Each word hit him like a hammer blow. Tommy Chun, Mrs. Chin's grandson, has asthma so bad he's been hospitalized 6 times. He's 9 years old. His parents moved across town, but they can't afford to move his grandmother. So he visits her every weekend and comes home wheezing. Stop. David Martinez just got diagnosed with leukemia. He's 14, same age as Marcus. His mom asked me if I knew anyone who could help with medical bills. I said stop. Why? Getting uncomfortable hearing about the real consequences of your acceptable losses. Henry leaned against her doorframe, feeling older than he ever had. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me you're going to fix it. All of it. Even if it costs you everything. And if I do, if I confess and pay for cleanup and medical treatment and probably go to prison, what happens to us? Jasmine's eyes filled with tears. I don't know. I love you, Henry, but I also love those families. I love Marcus and all my students who live in neighborhoods like Riverside. How do I choose? You shouldn't have to. That evening, Henry called a press conference. No lawyers. No prepared statements, no damage control. Just him, a microphone, and 20 years of buried truth. My name is Henry Porter, and I want to tell you about the worst thing I've ever done. The reporters leaned forward, cameras flashing as Henry began the confession that would end his old life forever. He told them about Riverside, about the environmental reports they'd buried, about the families who'd gotten sick while he got rich, about the children who died while he counted profits. I can't bring back the people we lost, he said, his voice breaking. I can't undo the damage to families who trusted developers to keep them safe, but I can do everything in my power to clean up the mess I made. He announced the dissolution of his business empire. Every asset would go toward environmental cleanup and medical treatment for affected families. He would fund long-term health monitoring and establish a permanent foundation to prevent similar tragedies. I know this doesn't make us even, Henry concluded. Nothing can balance the scales when human lives are involved. But it's a start. In the audience, Jasmine watched the man she loved destroy himself to save people he'd never met. Watched him trade everything he'd built for the chance to rebuild what he'd broken. After the cameras stopped rolling, after the reporters rushed off to file their stories, Henry found her in the empty auditorium. So he said, "That happened. That happened," she agreed. "I'll probably go to prison. Definitely be bankrupt. Might never be able to offer you the kind of life you deserve." "What kind of life do I deserve?" "One with a man who tells you the truth from the beginning, who doesn't make you choose between love and justice." Jasmine stepped closer. "What if I told you I've never been more proud of anyone in my life? I'd say you have questionable taste in men." "Maybe, but you're my questionable taste in men." She kissed him then, in that empty auditorium where he'd just confessed to crimes that would likely end his freedom. Kissed him because sometimes love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone brave enough to become better. "What happens now?" Henry asked. "Now we find out if redemption is real, or just something we tell ourselves to sleep at night." Outside, news vans were already gathering. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and investigations and consequences that would reshape both their lives. But tonight, they held each other and believed in second chances. Sometimes the hardest part of loving someone isn't standing by them when they're strong. It's staying when they've lost everything. 6 months later, Henry sat in a federal courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his usual $1,000 suit. The judge had just sentenced him to 5 years in prison, and the woman he loved was crying in the gallery behind him. But they weren't tears of sadness. The defendant's unprecedented cooperation with authorities and commitment to victim compensation has been noted, the judge said. However, the severity of environmental crimes that resulted in loss of life cannot be overlooked. 5 years. It could have been 20. As the bailiff led Henry away, he caught Jasmine's eye. She mouthed, "I love you," and pressed her hand to her heart. It was the last conversation they'd have without glass between them for a long time. The media called it the trial of the decade. Billionaire's fall from grace dominated headlines. Some painted Henry as a monster finally getting justice. Others saw a man trying to atone for past sins. But in Riverside, something different was happening. The cleanup had begun immediately after Henry's confession. Professional teams worked around the clock to remove contaminated soil, treat groundwater, and test air quality. For the first time in decades, children could play outside without their parents worrying about poison. Maria Santos watched her youngest daughter, Carmen, run through their backyard, the same yard where she'd once forbidden her kids to play. The grass was new, planted in clean soil that had cost more to import than most people made in a year. "Is it weird to feel grateful to someone who hurt you?" she asked her sister. "I don't know." But Carmen's laughing. "That's all that matters right now." At the prison, visiting hours came twice a week. Jasmine never missed one. "You look tired," Henry said during their 3rd month of visits. "Running a foundation is harder than I thought." Jasmine managed a smile. "The Riverside Recovery Fund is processing medical claims faster than we expected." Good news, but overwhelming. Henry had insisted she take charge of victim compensation, partly because she understood the community, but mostly because he trusted her completely. Even from prison, watching her manage millions of dollars with perfect integrity, he fell deeper in love. Dr. Patterson says Tommy Chin's asthma has improved dramatically since they cleaned up his grandmother's neighborhood, she continued. He's playing soccer now. And David Martinez? Responding well to treatment. The new children's cancer wing at Harlem Hospital is state-of-the-art, thanks to your donation. She still struggled with calling it that. Prison had cost Henry everything, but somehow the man sitting across from her seemed more at peace than the billionaire she'd first met. "I have something to tell you," Jasmine said during a visit in month 4. Henry's stomach dropped. He'd been waiting for this conversation, the one where she realized loving a convicted felon was too hard, too complicated, too much sacrifice for not enough future. I'm scared to hear it, he admitted. The kids at school want to write you letters. Marcus especially. He says you taught him that rich doesn't mean evil. It just means responsible. Not what Henry had expected. I'm not sure I'm the best role model. Maybe not. But you're proof that people can change, even when it costs them everything. That's a lesson worth teaching. Their relationship had evolved in ways neither had anticipated. Love distilled to its purest form. Hour-long conversations through prison phones, hands pressed against glass during visits, letters that said everything they couldn't express in person. They talked about books, about the Foundation's work, about dreams for after Henry's release. They never talked about marriage or children or the normal future that prison had put on indefinite hold. Do you ever regret it? Henry asked during a visit in month 6. Falling for someone who came with so much baggage. Every day, Jasmine said, then smiled at his expression. I regret that you carried that guilt alone for 20 years. I regret that families suffered while you convinced yourself you'd fix it later. I regret that we lost time we could have spent together. But not falling in love? Never that. Outside the prison walls, the world was changing. The Riverside neighborhood was transforming from a forgotten corner of the city into a model community. New businesses were opening, property values were rising, and for the first time in decades, young families were moving in instead of moving out. But gentrification brought new problems. Some longtime residents worried about being priced out of their newly valuable neighborhoods. It's like we've traded one problem for another, Jasmine told Henry during a visit. Clean up the environment, but risk displacing the people we were trying to help. What if we set aside housing for long-time residents? Price controls, community land trusts, something to protect people who've been there through the worst of it. Even from prison, Henry was finding ways to solve problems. It reminded Jasmine why she'd fallen in love with him. Not the wealth or power, but the mind that never stopped looking for solutions. I love you, she said suddenly. I love you too. But why now? Because you're still trying to fix things, even when you can't personally benefit. Because you've lost everything and somehow become more yourself than ever. As visiting hours ended and they prepared to say goodbye for another 3 days, Henry pressed his hand against the glass. Will you wait for me? He asked. For 5 years? Try stopping me. But they both knew 5 years was a long time. People change. Circumstances change. Love changes. The only question was whether their love would grow stronger in the waiting or break under the weight of time and distance. 3.5 years left to find out. They say every ending is a new beginning, but what happens when your new beginning looks nothing like the life you planned? 4 years and 2 months later, Henry Porter walked out of federal prison carrying a single box of belongings and wearing clothes Jasmine had brought him, jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and sneakers that felt strange after years in prison-issued boots. She was waiting by her car, and for a moment they just stared at each other. For years of phone calls and visits through glass hadn't prepared them for this, standing in the same space, breathing the same air, finally able to touch without barriers between them. Hi, she said. yourself. And then she was in his arms, and 4 years of separation disappeared like they'd never happened. You ready for this? Jasmine asked as they drove through the city. It's not the same world you left. She was right. The New York skyline looked different. New buildings, different billboards, changes that marked time passing. But the biggest change was in Henry himself. Prison had stripped away everything he'd used to define himself. No wealth, no power, no empire to run. Just a man learning to build something new from nothing. Their first stop was Riverside. The neighborhood was unrecognizable. Clean streets, thriving businesses, children playing in parks built on soil that had once been poisoned. But it was still affordable, still home to many of the families who'd lived there through the worst of it. Mrs. Chun, now 87, was still tending her garden. But these roses bloomed like champions, fed by earth that had been healed from the ground up. Henry, she squinted at him through thick glasses. My goodness, you look different. 4 years in prison will do that, he said with a smile that held no bitterness. Are you the one who fixed our neighborhood? I'm the one who broke it first. Fixing it was the least I could do. She studied his face for a long moment. You have good eyes now. Sad but good. Come back and visit an old lady sometime. At the community center, expanded now into 3 buildings serving hundreds of families, Marcus was teaching a financial literacy class to younger kids. 22 years old, graduated from college on a scholarship funded by Henry's Foundation, and working as a community organizer. Mr. Porter, Marcus grinned and bear-hugged the man who'd helped change his life's trajectory. You missed my graduation, but I saved you some cake. 4-year-old cake might be a little stale. Nah, Ms. Williams has been keeping it in the freezer, just in case. That night, in Jasmine's apartment, the same one she'd lived in before Henry's world exploded. They sat on her couch like teenagers on a first date, uncertain how to navigate this new version of themselves. So, Jasmine said, "What now? Honestly, I have no idea. I'm 38 years old with a felony record and no money. Not exactly a catch. You were never a catch because of your money. What was I a catch for?" She considered this seriously. Your terrible coffee-making skills. Your way of listening like every word matters. How you remember everyone's names and their kids' names and what they're worried about. The fact that you read 3 books a week in prison and wrote me letters analyzing each one. Those are pretty specific things to love about someone. I've had 4 years to make a list. They made love that night, like people who'd been holding their breath for years and finally remembered how to breathe. Gentle and desperate and grateful all at once. 6 months later, Henry was working construction again. Not as therapy this time, but as a job. His boss, a woman named Rosa who'd grown up in Riverside, treated him like any other worker. No special consideration for his past or his fall from grace. "Porter, you're decent with a hammer for a white-collar criminal," she said one day as they framed a new, affordable housing project. "Thanks, I think." Wasn't a compliment. Decent isn't good enough. My crew expects excellent. Henry learned excellent. He learned to show up early and work through lunch and take pride in calloused hands and aching muscles. He learned that building things was different from acquiring them, and the satisfaction ran deeper. Evenings were for the foundation work, reviewing applications, visiting families, ensuring that the cleanup and medical monitoring continued. The Riverside Recovery Fund had helped over 200 families and funded research that prevented similar disasters in other cities. You know what's strange? Jasmine said one evening as they walked through the neighborhood where they'd first worked together. I always thought love stories were supposed to end with the wedding and the house and the happily ever after. This isn't happily ever after. This is better. This is Messier and H. She stopped walking. Are you asking? Henry dropped to one knee right there on the sidewalk where Mrs. Rodriguez used to sell fruit, where children now played safely in the evening air. Jasmine Williams, will you marry a reformed criminal with no money, questionable prospects, and a tendency to overthink everything? Only if he promises to keep making terrible coffee and reading me book reviews in bed. Deal. They married 6 months later in the community center, surrounded by families whose lives had been touched by both Henry's crimes and his redemption. Not a fairy tale ending, but something rarer, a love story built on truth, tested by consequences and proven by time. Sometimes the best love stories don't end with happily ever after. Sometimes they end with what happens next and the courage to find out together.